Do you live in Venezuela? Do you live in Caracas, in La Guaira, in the states of Carabobo, Aragua, Miranda, Trujillo, or Yaracuy? Do you have family anywhere along Venezuela's northern coast, the same Caribbean coastline that, on the evening of June 24th, 2026, became the site of the most powerful earthquake to strike this country in more than 125 years? If the answer is yes, this video is for you. And if you are watching from anywhere else in the world and you believe Venezuela's earthquake problem is someone else's story, you need to stay for every word of what comes next. Because what happened in 39 seconds on Wednesday evening has already changed that country forever, and the story is not close to finished. At 6:04 in the evening, local time, on June 24th, 2026, a magnitude 7.2 earthquake struck east-northeast of San Felipe, the capital city of Yaracuy State in northwestern Venezuela. The USGS pinned its depth at 21.9 kilometers, or roughly 13.5 miles below the surface. That event, on its own, would have been Venezuela's most significant earthquake in years, an emergency requiring full national mobilization. But the ground was not finished. 39 seconds later, before the shaking from the 7.2 had even fully registered in the bodies and brains of the millions of people experiencing it, the earth ruptured again. A magnitude 7.5 earthquake struck southeast of a town called Umare, also in Yaracuy State, at a depth of only 10 kilometers, barely 6 miles below the surface, shallow enough to transfer the full, devastating weight of a major tectonic rupture almost directly into the buildings, roads, and coastlines above it. The two epicenters sat only about 5 kilometers apart. In the language of seismology, this kind of event has a specific name. It is called a doublet, and it is, as the USGS itself described it, an unusually rare occurrence. Two major fault ruptures, happening at nearly the same location, separated by less than the time it takes most people to process that the first one is happening. Most people living through it experience the whole thing as one single, terrifying, extended event. A woman who escaped from a collapsed building in Caracas told reporters afterward that when the shaking started, all the walls were cracked, that she and her neighbors had to force open a door that had warped in its frame, crawl through a cloud of dust so thick it blinded them, and climb over rubble just to reach the street. She said the scene was like a horror movie. Another Caracas resident, Martha Añez, could not get out of her apartment at all. She described leaning out onto her balcony, screaming that she was trapped, not knowing whether the floor beneath her would hold. Dr. Frank Odemard, a seismologist who is one of the foremost experts on Venezuelan tectonics, and who happened to be in his second-floor flat in the El Llanito neighborhood of eastern Caracas that evening, later described in writing what it felt like from inside. He felt the P-waves arriving twice in rapid succession while lying down watching soccer. Then came a 2 to 4 second silence. Then the S-waves hit, shaking him strongly for more than 10 to 12 seconds. The water in a glass on his table began seeping, a slow slosh back and forth. Trophies on the top shelf of his bookcase fell to the floor. It was hard to stand up and walk. He felt dizzy walking down the stairs to street level. He went outside. He stayed outside. But here's the problem. The 7,200 people from Baruta municipality who confirmed at least 3 fatalities from the collapse of 2 structures within hours of the event were only the beginning of a number that was always going to grow, and grow it has. By early morning on June 25th, Acting President Delcy Rodriguez announced in a national televised address that at least 164 people were dead and 971 were injured. That toll, she said, was expected to increase. Earlier, overnight figures had placed the dead at only 32 and the injured at 700, meaning that in the space of a few hours of darkness, as rescue teams and local volunteers pulled at rubble by flashlight across Caracas and the surrounding states, the death toll had multiplied more than 5 times over. Search and rescue operations are still ongoing as of this video. Buildings are still being searched. People are still buried. The geography of this disaster spreads across an enormous area of northern Venezuela, the coastal state of La Guaira, which sits barely 30 kilometers north of Caracas, and serves as the primary connection between the capital and the sea, was declared a disaster zone. More than 100 buildings collapsed in La Guaira alone, according to a United Nations humanitarian agency. A large waterfront hotel in the city of Macuto has been completely reduced to rubble. In the nearby town of Catia Lamar, videos geolocated by CNN show multiple collapsed buildings and badly damaged high-rises standing with their facades torn off. Floors of apartments exposed to the open air like the inside of a broken doll's house. Fishermen out on the coast watched in shock as dust clouds rolled down from the direction of the city, the signature of structures falling simultaneously across a wide urban front. Cell phone signal and internet connectivity in La Guaira were completely severed following the quakes, leaving families unable to reach relatives and cutting emergency coordinators off from the communities that needed them most. People with family in La Guaira were reportedly reaching out on social media platforms to ask strangers to help them find out if their loved ones were alive. In Caracas itself, Venezuelan Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello identified the neighborhoods of Los Palos Grandes and Altamira in the east of the city as having the most alarming situations, and the images and footage from those areas confirm why. An AFP journalist on the ground witnessed a 22-story building completely destroyed in Altamira. People stood at the base of the ruins calling out relatives' names while volunteers climbed over rubble. In southeastern Caracas, in an area not yet publicly named in early reports, observers described an area where almost all high-rise buildings had sustained heavy damage or collapsed entirely. A 14-floor building was leveled. A bank building in the city center came down. Toppled electric poles and debris blocked streets across multiple districts. Parts of the capital lost power and cell phone signal simultaneously, meaning that rescue teams were trying to coordinate efforts across a fragmented, partially dark, partially silent city. Thousands of residents chose to spend the night outdoors, on the sidewalks and in the parks, sitting with their pets and whatever possessions they had grabbed on the way out, afraid to go back inside any building that still stood. In a country already experiencing rolling power outages before the earthquake struck, the sudden catastrophic loss of additional infrastructure fell on a population with almost no margin left to absorb it. And now it gets worse because Simón Bolívar International Airport, Venezuela's primary international aviation gateway and the connection point for the more than 7.7 million Venezuelans who have left the country during years of economic crisis and are now desperately trying to find out if their families are alive, suffered damage significant enough to shut it down entirely. Parts of the terminal roof collapsed. Debris fell through the ceiling of passenger areas. Videos showed passengers running for cover as the terminal shook and the lights flickered during the shaking itself. All arrivals and departures were canceled. The airport, which normally processes the flow of an entire nation's diaspora connections, went dark as a travel hub at the exact moment that diaspora most needed it open. This next part matters, because the USGS did not issue a routine alert for this earthquake. The Prompt Assessment of Global Earthquakes for Response System, known as PAGER, issues a red alert only once or twice per year across the entire planet, reserving that designation for events where it models a high probability of mass casualties and widespread destruction at a scale that may require international assistance. For the magnitude 7.5 main shock of June 24th, USGS issued a red alert. The explicit language used by the agency was this: high casualties and extensive damage are probable, and the disaster is likely widespread. PAGER went further. Its probabilistic models placed a 44% chance on the final death toll reaching between 10,000 and 100,000, with a 30% probability that the toll surpasses 100,000 entirely. Economic loss models placed a 39% probability on losses between 10 and 100 billion US dollars, and a 30% probability that losses would exceed $100 billion altogether. The upper range of estimated economic losses amounts to up to 20% of Venezuela's entire GDP. These are not extreme scenarios conjured to frighten. These are the agency's own probability-weighted forecasts, built on decades of empirical data correlating shaking intensity, population density, and building vulnerability, and they reflect a catastrophe whose true shape is still being uncovered from beneath collapsed concrete in the dark. Most people are missing this part of the story, the reason this particular fault in this particular country was always capable of producing exactly this kind of event, and why the people who study it have been warning about it for decades. Northern Venezuela lies along one of South America's most consequential but least publicly discussed seismic systems. The Caribbean plate is moving eastward relative to the South American plate at a rate of roughly 20 millimeters per year, and the boundary between those two plates runs almost directly along Venezuela's northern coastline in the form of the Bocono-Morón-El Pilar fault system. It is a series of right lateral strike-slip faults, meaning that instead of one plate diving beneath the other, the way the Pacific Ring of Fire works, the two plates are grinding horizontally past each other like two enormous slabs of the planet's crust, trying to pass through the same narrow hallway at the same time. This fault system runs 1,300 kilometers across northern Venezuela, from the central Venezuelan Andes, through the north-central and northeastern coast, and all the way toward Trinidad. The June 24th rupture occurred right at the junction between two of the major named segments of this system, the Oca-Ancon fault to the west and the El Pilar fault to the east, exactly at the point where the Bocono fault splays off to the southwest. This is not a random location. It is one of the most structurally stressed points along an already dangerous fault boundary, and the seismologists studying these structures have known for years that the accumulated stress on this part of the system had not been fully released by smaller, more frequent events. Here is why this is serious in a way that even the death toll alone cannot fully communicate. A magnitude 7.5 earthquake on a strike-slip fault at 10 kilometers depth produces ground shaking that extends its most violent effects across a broad urban landscape in ways that differ critically from deeper earthquakes. The rupture itself is typically somewhere between 100 and 200 kilometers long, with several meters of average slip along that entire length. Scientists writing about this event noted that the earthquakes originated approximately 170 kilometers west of Caracas, meaning a rupture propagating eastward along the fault could, in the worst geometry, have extended close to the capital region. Whether it did is a question being answered right now by seismologists mapping the aftershock distribution, which outlines the ruptured fault area the way dots outline a drawing. The answer will determine how much of the fault has been relieved and how much strain remains available for future events on the segments that did not rupture on June 24th. What happened next changed everything about how Venezuela experiences a national emergency in 2026, and it comes down to the specific fragility that existed before the earthquake even struck. Venezuela has been living through an economic collapse of historic proportions for years, producing one of the fastest inflation rates in the world and driving more than 7.7 million people to leave the country entirely. The infrastructure that was already failing before the earthquake, the power grid producing rolling blackouts, the water systems running intermittently, the telecommunications networks operating at reduced capacity, is now trying to function under the weight of catastrophic new damage in the regions hardest hit by the quakes. The country's oil industry, which sits at the economic center of Venezuela's existence, saw no immediate disruption at its Paraguaná refinery hub, 225 kilometers west of the epicenter. And the Port of Jose complex and Puerto La Cruz refinery were also unaffected in early reports. But the disaster will strain an economy that was already at or beyond its breaking point. And the loss of functioning airport infrastructure, communications networks, and housing stock at this scale, in a country with almost no fiscal reserves to deploy, creates a recovery timeline measured not in weeks, but in years. One more thing you need to know is how this Wednesday night fits into Venezuela's longer seismic memory, because the country has been here before, and the history is not a comfort. On March 26, 1812, Caracas was struck by what researchers now believe was a sequence of twin destructive shocks arriving within 30 minutes of each other, and that event destroyed much of both Caracas and Merida, the city 500 kilometers to the southwest. Estimates of the 1812 death toll range from 15,000 to 30,000 people, depending on the source, and historians note that the earthquake also fell on a holiday, Holy Thursday, when churches were full and public gatherings were large. In a moment of almost unbearable historical symmetry, June 24, 2026, is the Venezuelan national holiday, marking the 205th anniversary of the 1821 Battle of Carabobo, the decisive confrontation that secured the country's independence. Many Venezuelans were home from work, gathered with family, in exactly the setting where a sudden collapse of the walls and ceiling around you carries the highest possible human cost. In 1967, a much smaller magnitude, 6.5 earthquake killed approximately 280 people in Caracas and collapsed apartment blocks in the city. Residents who survived both the 1967 event and June 24th told reporters this week that 2026 felt worse. The most comparable event in terms of raw magnitude, the magnitude 7.7 earthquake that struck Venezuela's same Caribbean coast in 1900, predates modern seismic instrumentation and urban development in the region. The June 2026 doublet is the largest instrumentally recorded earthquake in this specific zone of Venezuela, meaning there is no modern data set for how Venezuela's current building stock, its current population density, and its current infrastructure condition respond to shaking of this magnitude. What seismologists and structural engineers had long projected would happen if a major earthquake struck this fault near Venezuela's populated northern coast is now, for the first time in the instrumental record, no longer a projection. It is a documented reality being excavated from the rubble of Caracas and La Guaira, one collapsed building at a time. This is where it becomes dangerous for anyone watching from outside Venezuela to treat this as a contained, geographically distant story. 26 minutes after the doublet in Venezuela ended, a separate magnitude 6.9 earthquake struck northern Japan. Seismologists noted this timing explicitly and could not entirely exclude at the time of writing that the seismic waves from Venezuela's rupture, traveling through the earth at the speed of kilometers per second, had added the small additional stress needed to trigger a fault in Japan that was already close to rupture. Most scientists consider this unlikely, and Japan has its own continuous seismic activity independent of anything happening in South America. But the fact that the world's foremost seismologists were actively discussing, in real time, whether a fault in Venezuela could have triggered a fault in Japan within the same hour, is itself a statement about the interconnected, continuously stressed nature of the global tectonic system that most people never have occasion to think about, until a moment like this one. The international response began within hours. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said at President Trump's direction, search teams, medical resources, and humanitarian aid were already being deployed to Venezuela. Trump wrote publicly that the earthquakes were both massive in scale and had left a devastating number of deaths, and that the United States was ready, willing, and able to help. The Venezuelan interim government, led by acting President Rodriguez following the capture of former President Nicolas Maduro in January, confirmed the call and accepted the assistance, marking a degree of diplomatic realignment between Washington and Caracas that would have seemed unimaginable only a year ago. The geopolitics of the relationship between the United States and Venezuela are complicated, rooted in decades of tension and transformed by the January intervention that removed Maduro. But no earthquake waits for political conditions to be ideal before it strikes, and neither do search and rescue teams. Right now, in the rubble of Los Palos Grandes, teams with dogs and listening equipment are moving through the wreckage of a 22-story building that no longer exists above the third floor. In La Guaira, where communication lines are only partially restored, families who fled their homes before they fell are camping on the waterfront, waiting for crews to tell them whether anything of what they had is left. In Yaracuy State, close to the epicentral zone itself, communities smaller than Caracas and with fewer resources and less international attention are dealing with the same collapsed structures, the same severed roads, the same missing neighbors and relatives, and almost certainly higher per capita casualty rates than the capital. The USGS aftershock forecast puts the probability of a magnitude 6 or greater aftershock at approximately 40% in the first week alone, and calls a magnitude 5 or greater aftershock in the coming days all but certain. Buildings that did not fully collapse on June 24th, but that are now cracked, tilted, or compromised in ways not visible from the outside, are the next wave of danger. Engineers and urban search and rescue teams know from decades of disaster response that the greatest secondary killer after a major urban earthquake is not always the aftershocks themselves. It is the buildings that survive the first hit in a condition that will not survive the second. The magnitude 7.2 that struck at 6:04 on June 24th was, by itself, already a historic Venezuelan emergency. The magnitude 7.5 that arrived 39 seconds later turned that emergency into a catastrophe that the USGS models suggest could ultimately claim thousands to tens of thousands of lives as the full picture emerges from across the affected states. At least 164 people are confirmed dead as of this morning. At least 971 are confirmed injured. More than 100 buildings have collapsed in La Guaira alone. Simón Bolívar International Airport is closed. Power is out across parts of the capital. The fault that did this has been building stress for well over a century and has a geological history stretching back to an 1812 event that killed tens of thousands of people on the same holiday that was being observed when the ground moved again last night. Search teams are still working, the rubble is still being opened, and somewhere along the 1,300-kilometer fault system that runs the length of northern Venezuela, the sections that did not rupture on June 24th still carry the accumulated stress of decades, loaded, patient, and eventually inevitable. The death toll of 164 will not be the final number. The aftershocks will not stop tonight. And what gets built to replace what fell will determine, for a generation, whether Venezuela is more prepared or less prepared. The next time, this fault decides it cannot hold any longer.